Good morning to you all. I'm your host, Amina Ghazanfar, and I warmly welcome you all to the much-awaited book launch of Aspiring Child, a biography of Mary W. Shelley. It is a collection of 100 sonnets dedicated to chronicling and honoring the life of renowned Victorian novelist Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley by the American poet and educator Dr. Ted Morrissey. This book has been published recently, and we have gathered here to discuss, appreciate, and celebrate it with the author himself, and so that the students of our department may gain deeper insights into one of the most prominent figures in Victorian literature. Before we begin, I would like to invite our Dean, Dr. Arshad Mahmood, to deliver the welcome address.
Assalamu alaikum. Good morning to everybody. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, sir. You are.
Yes, sir. Walaikum assalam. You're audible.
I would like to welcome Dr. Ted Morrissey to this webinar. I'm thankful to him really because I can see the excitement on the part of our students, BA students, who've contributed to this book, Vox-Humana. And at the same time, I would like to thank Dr. Amina Ghazanfar, who's been engaged with Dr. Ted Morrissey since the beginning of this project. And now even the high ups at NUML, they know that our students at BAS level, BS English, have contributed a lot in the form of book that is going to soon, come up. And I hope we'll be able to show them the book. And I believe in future we can work together because I can feel that our students are really excited to work with Dr. Ted Morrissey. For today's session, I would like to thank Dr. Amina Ghazanfar for organizing this and Ms. Amina Ghazanfar for moderating this session. I'm equally thankful for patronizing this thing. And we look forward to more webinars like that. I wish I could attend the previous ones too, but I could not because of one reason or the other. Anyway, there are so many people right now waiting for the session to start. I would like you to please go ahead. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And thank you, everyone, for setting this up and for your interest in my book and hosting the book launch, especially Dr. Ghazanfar. I appreciate our relationship, our collegial relationship over the last few years, and look forward to more, working together on various projects and so on. Yes, as you know, this is on the occasion of my book, Aspiring Child, a biography of Mary W. Shelley in Sonnets. And what I'd like to do, I'm going to say this evening, I know it's morning there, but it's evening here, is to do a couple of things. I want to talk a little bit about Mary Shelley. I know you already have some familiarities. Hopefully I won't bore you with things you already know, but give you some context. So give some context in terms of what I had in mind and why I wrote this book and so on. And then, the last half or so of my presentation, read some of the sonnets from the book and so on. It's very exciting to find out that you all have, or many of you have read the sonnets and have had a chance to discuss them and have some ideas about them you'd like to share with me. I'm eager to hear what you have to say. Let me go ahead and see if I can share a little visual aid.
Dr. Morrissey, I just need to interrupt you. Sorry.
Yes.
The format of today's discussion would be, sorry, I'll interrupt you. We will first go for our students' discussions.
Okay.
We would want you to listen to them. We'll introduce you formally. Our host will introduce you. We'll move towards the students' discussions so that they can listen. You can listen to them, and then they'll take notes when you speak. And then we'll move towards your reading. We'll first take the students' presentations. I hope it's okay with you.
Absolutely. No, that's fine.
Because we would want you to listen to their ideas too. They've already read the sonnets. So they will talk about your work first, and then we'll move towards yours. I'm sorry for interruption. Amina, if you could please introduce Dr. Morrissey to the audience.
Yes, sure. Dr. Mahmood, I would like to thank you for your generous remarks and your continuous assistance in helping us organize these sessions. I will now introduce our guest speaker for today, Dr. Ted Morrissey, the esteemed author of this book. We would like to thank him, first of all, for making time to join us at this hour, as it is currently 11:30, I believe, in the US. He has joined us previously for a webinar titled An Interactive Session on Popular Fiction and Historical Perspective in February of last year. And throughout last year, he would guide students of this department on using a psychoanalytic lens to develop their theoretical framework, give them feedback on their approaches to a literary analysis of his short story, Vox Humana. That webinar was a resounding success, as students were in a better place to dissect the short story, and the term papers they produced as a result were even compiled and published in the form of a casebook. Dr. Morrissey is a poet, novelist, scholar, theorist, and educator. He has written several novels and novellas, as well as collections and scholarly monographs. He has taught at various universities in the United States of America and is currently teaching at the Lindenwood University, St. Charles, Missouri, as an adjunct lecturer in MFA in the Writing Accelerated program. He also teaches at the Southern New Hampshire University as an adjunct instructor for the Institute's global campus. His award-winning novels include The Artist Spoke, Mrs. Saville, and Crow Song for the Stricken. His novel excerpts, stories, poems, critical articles, reviews, and translations have appeared in around 120 publications, including Glimmer Train Stories, Paris Transcontinental, The North American Review, to name a few. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Morrissey. It is an absolute honor for us to have you here. His most recent work, Aspiring Child, A Biography of Mary W. Shelley, has been received by faculty members and students of our department with great enthusiasm, with some readers who would like to present their analysis of the book. I invite some of the students of our department to share their thoughts on the sonnets.
Ilaf, are you there?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, please go ahead and start.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ilaf Raslan, and I'm a student of 8th semester enrolled in the program BS in English. Before beginning my speech, I would like to express my own thoughts on Aspiring Child. When I read the book, I was specifically influenced. I really liked the way Mr. Morrissey, presented Mary Shelley's life. I almost felt like it was a motion picture. So I really liked how you autobiographically constructs her life. I really liked it. It felt like I was witnessing her life with my own eyes, in front of my own eyes. So I really liked it, and I could feel the empathy and sympathy both for her, and I could feel as if whatever she felt, I felt like I could feel it in those sonnets as well. So I'll be starting my poem. My speech. Today, I will be discussing Sonnets 1 to 20 from Aspiring Child by Ted Morrissey. This poetic biography reimagines Mary Shelley's life, the writer of Frankenstein. Rather than presenting simple fact, Morrissey reconstructs it chronologically through a psychological and literary lens. Before I begin, let me clarify a common misconception. That is, in Frankenstein, Frankenstein is not a monster. Victor is the creator or the scientist. The being itself remains unnamed. And this absence of name is not merely accidental, it is philosophical. It forces us to ask who bears responsibility of creation and what defines identity, the maker or the product. Now, turning to the sonnets. The first 20 sonnets do not simply depict a childhood, they chart the formation of a consciousness shaped by grief, sharpened by intellect, and uh, destabilized by passion. In Sonnets 1 and 2, we encounter not just an event, but a rupture, the death of Mary Wollstonecraft. This is not merely maternal loss, it is what we might call a primal absence, an ontological lack, a void at the very core of being. Morrissey captured this through haunting imagery, gothic imagery, graves, silence, and shadows, echoes that will reverberate through Mary's own writings. From the very beginning, her imagination is not nurtured by presence. It is rather evoked by absence, the absence of her own mother. As we move to Sonnet 5 and 6, we find Mary in the intellectually yet emotionally austere world of William Godwin, her father. Surrounded by books, philosophy, and debate, she is intellectually liberated but emotionally neglected. Here emerges a striking contradiction, a dialectical conflict between intellect and emotion. Knowledge empowers her yet isolates her. And what happens when a mind is sharpened but a heart remains unanchored? Then comes a turning point, Sonnet 14 and 15, the arrival of Percy Bysshe Shelley. Here enters passion, defiance, romance, and intoxication. Percy represents freedom, rebellion, and promising quest for transcendence. But we must ask, freedom from whom? While Percy chases ideas, Mary bears the consequences, emotional upheaval, and societal judgment. Instability. Their relationship becomes a paradox, a source of inspiration, yet also a suffering. And finally, we arrive at Geneva in 1816, the convergence point. Through sonnets 19 and 20, grief, science, and environment collide. As Morrissey quotes, "Oh, to burn with that power to beneath oppressive clouds, where nightmares waited quietly." The discussions of galvanism, the dark storm, laden skies, and Mary's inner turmoil fuse into a singular creative moment. And this is not mere imagination. It is experience of the sublime, where terror and identity intertwine. From a psychoanalytic perspective, what is the creator if not projection? A manifestation of internal trauma, a being that demands recognition, just as Mary herself negotiates identity, loss, and responsibility. So, what do these sonnets ultimately reveal? They reveal that Mary Shelley is not simply a writer shaped by her time, but a consciousness constructed through fragmentation, loss, intellect, societal gaze, and romantic passion. And they do not resolve within her. They collide and they form that, then the collision form that emerges a collision in creation. Then Frankenstein then is not just a novel. It is a response to absence, to contradiction, to the human need to create meaning from chaos. And with this understanding, I now invite Vasia to continue the journey through Sonnets 21 to 40, tracing further the evolution of Mary Shelley's life and literary legacy. Thank you for your patient listening and thoughtful attention.
Well, that was very nice, very, very interesting. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. Shall I wait for other students to share their material?
Yeah. We have four more students. I hope it's not too long. Wasia, are you there?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, please.
Thank you so much, Ilaf. As Ilaf has brought us to the point where we can have further discussion on Mary Shelley's experiences at Lake of Geneva, particularly at Aveyron. For that, I was here Aman from section C, eighth semester, BS in English. I'll be discussing Mary Shelley's experiences of isolation and alienation, particularly at the Lake of Geneva. From the book of Dr. Ted Morrissey, Aspiring Child, that is a panoramic view of an extraordinary woman who led an extraordinary life in the view of Dr. Morrissey himself, in the words of himself, who is a renowned author, who is a renowned scholar, also known as modern-day Hawthorne. Sonnets 21 to 40 draw the paradoxical tension through antithetical imagery, particularly revealed and consolidated in Sonnet 25, when Mary Shelley preferred haunting to abandonment. When she was left alone at Aveyron, particularly at the Lake of Geneva, when she was left only with the responsibility of copying Byron's cantos. Her ontological solitude and her epistemic alienation and isolation was revealed particularly in Sonnet 39, that was named Absence. Um, that was named Absence when the story of a very little girl is highlighted who spent long hours around her mother's grave. But you know what? Received nothing except from silence. Apart from that, if I view that with the lens of universal and cosmic detachment from existence that was revealed in Sonnet 26, when Mary Shelley's participation in E. Darwin's New Science was extremely discouraged. She's feeling isolated and alienated, despite she was having everything around her, despite she was having everybody around her, yet she is feeling incomplete despite being having faithful friends around her, particularly those who were labeled as medicine for Mary Shelley's anemic love by Dr. Ted Morrissey as well. But still, she was feeling incomplete. Deficiency of blood is being symbolized with deficiency of incompleteness within Mary Shelley. Moreover, I'd continue with references to Sonnets 24 and 33 when Dr. Tad Morrissey used antithetic comparison, antithetic imagery of light and dark. Dark and light in Sonnets 24 and 33 respectively when he symbolized darkness for isolation and alienation of Mary W. Shelley, but tasks were done best in darkness. While talking about light, light was used as a symbol for hope and resilience. As Dr. Ted Morrissey asserts, what may not be expected in the country of an eternal light? Talking this from the lens of epistemic and spiritual isolation and alienation of Mary W. Shelley, I'd refer it to Sonnet 37, Faith, when Mary was struggling with retrieving her faith despite she was having atheist friends around herself while her romantic companions were just sympathizing with Saturn, labeled as Milton to be a supreme and prime advocate for Saturn by Dr. Ted Morrissey himself. So, sonnets 21 to 40, they just trace the journey of solitude towards its dissipation along with that is evident again when we see in sonnet 33 when Dr. Ted Morrissey asserted that sun is forever visible. So, Sonnet 40 is about a Victor, the journey of Mary Shelley's erratic father towards softness. For that, I'm looking forward to Manal, who would be discussing that journey with references to sonnets 41 to 60. That's all from my side. I'm really thankful and grateful to you for your tolerance and patience listening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good evening to Professor Morrissey and good morning to everyone else. My name is Manal and I'll be presenting on a sequence of 20 sonnets. Now, these sonnets provide a very poignant look at one of the most complex figures in literary history, as we know, Mary Shelley. Now, the set of sonnets that I'm going to be dealing with particularly, it deals with the sort of transformative and mature phase of Mary Shelley's life. So you can see that it spans from her early maternal grief and the writing of Frankenstein all the way through the tragic deaths of her loved ones and finally into her years after the passing of her husband, Percy Shelley, and her struggle to define her legacy in her own terms rather than her husband's, right? So firstly, if we look at sonnets 41 to 45, for instance, it explores what I think is the enigma of creation. So the text is essentially connecting the monstrousness of Victor Frankenstein's creature to Mary's own scary or harrowing experiences with childbirth and domesticity. Now, it highlights this fear that domestic tranquility, for instance, as Professor Morrissey has written, was often a stratagem for female erasure. Now, if we look at Sonnet 41 specifically, Professor Morrissey has used a very sort of interesting juxtaposition here between, and I quote, the imagined baby long in your womb and the writhing thing that actually emerges. By asking ourselves, as Professor Morrissey has stated, how has long desired animation transformed beauty into ugliness? We sort of see that the text is suggesting that for Mary, creation was not an act of grace. It wasn't something to look at positively, but rather a catastrophe, right? This directly mirrors Victor Frankenstein's own repulsion at his creature. And sort of it reminds me of that movie line, you know, the horror, the horror. So Victor Frankenstein's own repulsion at his creature, but the author shifts this perspective to show that Mary's creature was just her own grief and her labor, a thing that could kill you, as Professor Morrissey writes. This helps, our understanding that in this phase of her life, Mary felt that her motherhood was it was just consuming her the same way the monstrousness consumed Frankenstein. Again, not in a very positive way of looking at motherhood as we would normally look at it. Uh, Next, we have sonnets 46 to 49, and these deal with very heavy subject matter. It is the historical suicides of her sister, Fanny Emily, and Harriet Shelley. Now, the tone of these sonnets is, of course, very morose, it's very sad, and that is to show how Mary used her own misery as the fuel for her own creative endeavors. In Sonnet 46, Professor Morrissey, I think, very neatly put it that he describes Harriet's death as drowning in cold facts. Now, of course, it's a great, I think, play on words, you could say, because Harriet Shelley actually did drown herself. I might be mistaken. Maybe she didn't drown herself. Maybe she drowned accidentally. It was an accident. But it does suggest that Mary didn't just feel this sort of emotional grief, you know. She felt this cold weight on her shoulders of the reality that she led, basically, where she replaced the original wife, which was Harriet Truman. And we know that Percy Shelley was a very promiscuous man. And, she essentially, I think Professor Morrissey is trying to show us that Mary, despite all of her, success as a writer, she couldn't really outrun this grief or this guilt, essentially. Then we have sonnets 50 to 56, where Professor Morrissey addresses her sort of intellectual struggle, right? As I mentioned earlier, how does her legacy how does her legacy differ from that of her husband's? Now, we see that Percy Shelley was Oxford educated, a very fancy guy. And, his Baroque style was often overshadowed Mary's direct and honest voice. And Professor Morrissey used a very, very lovely metaphor that I will hopefully, I want to steal in essentially, where he says that he turned her marble into lace. Now, to the audience over here, basically, when I read this line, it reminded me of this other very famous poem by Percy Shelley, and I'm sure it's one of my favorites. I think everybody here also really likes that poem. It's Ozymandias by Percy Shelley. Now, the way I saw it was that if we summarize the poem very quickly, Ozymandias, the poem is basically about a king that built a colossal statue for himself, even though it got buried in the sand, right? His legacy got buried in the sand. The irony here is that Percy did exactly to Mary what he was trying to criticize in that poem, right? He acted like the powerful king by sort of marginalizing his wife's own creative voice, you could say. She was the marble, the marble, I think, symbolizes this sort of uh, honesty, this strong sort of sense of, self, essentially. And his lace, I think, lace is obviously very fancy when we put it on our clothes. So his lace was trying to like cover up her honesty in a way. He was trying to make it seem fancier than it needed to be. So I think that Percy Shelley was a bit of a hypocrite because he buried his wife's true voice like the sand did to the statue. And basically, after his death, she's portrayed as being erased by the very editorial work she did to keep his name alive. Finally, we have sonnets 57 to 60, which focuses on her survival, essentially. And these lines basically touch upon her life in Italy and her role as a widow author. So, as we can see here, that there are themes of resurrection and poverty to show that Mary was obviously, she remained very tenacious despite all these difficult circumstances as she was socially and financially marginalized. So, if I were to summarize all these 20 sonnets essentially, we can say that it's a journey from the birth of a monster to the birth of a literary legend, essentially. So we can see that despite being bound to a man like Percy Shelley, who was, promiscuous, consistently unfaithful, and very emotionally elusive, because as I believe Mary was still pregnant and he was still engaging in in extramarital affairs. Mary's story doesn't really end here and end in his own shadow, you can say. So she transformed herself from a grieving wife into a powerhouse of literary endurance. So thank you so much for your time. I would like to hand it over to the next speaker to help us understand Mary Shelley's life a little bit more. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Manal. Thank you very much. Guys, I would want you to shorten your presentations a little bit, though they are really very interesting. We would want to listen to Dr. Morrissey also. So please. And Dr. Morrissey, we have time till 12. So we can maybe adjust the time also. We are left with two more students. They'll finish
Fine.
the whole 100 sonnets and then we'll come to you. Officially, it is 11 a.m., but we have been given time till 12 by the department. So we have officially 1 more hour with us. So we can, obviously, we have time to listen to you. We would want you to speak about these presentations also, but we are left with two more students. So just listen to them and then we'll go to your presentation. Thank you.
It's
Yes.
very interesting. No, this is great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now it's Muskan's turn to talk about the remaining sonnets from sonnet 61 to sonnet 80. So I would request Muskan to please begin her presentation. Over to you, Muskan.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I extend a very warm greeting to everyone present here today. My name is Muskan, and I am a student of 8th semester of NUML's BS in English program. Following Manal, I will now be presenting on sonnets 61 to 80 from Aspiring Child by Ted Morrissey. This section of the sonnet sequence explores the years 1818 to 1823, which was a defining period in Mary Shelley's early life. It was marked by intense personal tragedy as well as remarkable intellectual growth. At its core, the sequence examines grief and bereavement, maternal loss, emotional isolation, and the tension between personal suffering and literary creation that was experienced by Mary Shelley in this sensitive part of her life. One of the most dominant themes is the devastating loss of her children, which profoundly shaped both her life and her writing. Firstly, Sonnet 65 recounts the death of her infant daughter Clara, who died in Mary's arms in the summer of 1818. Then we have sonnet number 67 that presents the loss of her son William, who died of malaria in Rome 1819, which was a tragedy that left Mary morbidly depressed. Finally, we have sonnet number 77, which describes a life threatening miscarriage experienced by Mary at San Terenzo, where she nearly died before being saved through an ice bath. These repeated encounters with loss, they do not just shape her emotional state, they echo perfectly and powerfully in her literary work. poetry imagination. A key symbolic pattern, as noticed by Dr. Ted Morrissey, in this sequence is the imagery of fire and ice. These elements, they represent the uncontrollable energy, the emotional extremes, and the destruction that intervened with her survival as well as her creatures. This imagery, it also draws a striking parallel with the creature in her novel. The creature's despair, his sense of being both created and cursed, it mirrors Mary's own experience of grief, isolation, and emotional withdrawal. After the birth of her surviving child, Percy Florence, Mary becomes emotionally distant, almost fearful of forming deep attachments. This reflects a powerful psychological loss. Similarly, the creature's suffering is rooted in the absence of nurture and belonging. This connection, it deepens further when we come to Sonnet 77, where the creature's imagined death on frozen ice, it parallels Mary's real-life survival through an ice bath during hemorrhage. As noted excellently through Dr. Marissa's scholarly view, we observe that here life and death, fire and ice, fiction and reality begin to blur. The lines between all these, they begin to blur, and we feel it on a very personal level how Mary's personal struggles, they are depicted in what she wrote. And as a woman, my reading experience was greatly influenced when I read about her miscarriage and how beautifully she takes that pain and she incorporates it into her personal writing. And it impressed me how such a keen eye was observing that pattern, and it was making a connection. It really blew me off. Furthermore, in Sonnet 79, we see how the creature he's longing for a home in nature. Now this reflects Mary's own frustration at being constantly displaced and often having no control over her life and her decision, which was mainly controlled by the men around her. Yet, despite her suffering, Mary does not remain passive. She continued her intellectual pursuits and she studied Latin and Greek and at the same time, these sonnets highlight her struggle as a female author. Now we know that she published anonymously, she navigated balancing her personal identity as a writer, wife, and mother. Her domestic life, on the other hand, grew increasingly strained in the years she spent in Italy. She experienced emotional distance from Percy Shelley. His criticism of her grief heightened this misery, and his infatuations with other women, such as Jane Williams, it gave a rise to her tensions. Additionally, Sonnet 72 and 74, they reflect the dramas and the scandals that surrounded their domestic circles, including the rumors including Claire Clairmont and the tragic death of her daughter Allegra. By 1822, Mary becomes deeply disillusioned. She begins to recognize that she is not suited to a life of emotional chaos and radical instability. Instead, she longs for stability, loyalty, and emotional security. The sequence concludes with sonnet number 80. Here, Mary identifies with Homer's Penelope, a symbol of patience, endurance, and quiet strength. Like Penelope, Mary remains steadfast even as the men around her pursue their own ambitions. I thank you all for carefully listening to what I had to say about this set of sonnets. I will now hand it over to Samir, who will continue with the concluded sequence of Aspiring Child. Thank you all.
Thank you, Muskan.
Thank you, Muskan. I hope I'm audible to everyone here. Yes?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, so Assalamu alaikum and hello to our esteemed guest, Professor Dr. Ted Morrissey, to our Dean Dr. Azhar, HOD Dr. Mehdi, and all the respected faculty members, and to everyone joining today. I'm Samir Haider from English UGS 8th semester, and the part of sonnets from the book that I'll be covering ranges from 81 to the last sonnet, epilogue 100, and I think most of the material that has been included in the book has already been covered by the participants who came before me. So I'm just going to give you a rundown of what happens in the last few sections. And of course, all of us know that we have read uh, Percy B. Shelley in a lot of our courses through these 4 years of our degree. It was in Introduction to Literary Studies, and then a part of it came in literary criticism. And then we read extensively through his poetry when we were studying the course of Romantic and Victorian poetry. So we all had a knowledge of the poetry that Percy B. Shelley wrote. But when I was reading the book and I was reading the sonnets, some parts of the sonnets, I felt like the whole image of Percy B. Shelley was constructed in front of me. How life treated him and how he treated the life. Because of course it's the two-way process. And with that, that was of course a note towards the personal catharsis. I just want to say that these sonnets, of course, they come in the end from 81 to 100, but they fulfill the purpose of the core of this collection, even if they fall at the end of the book, the ones where everything breaks and then slowly everything begins again. They deal with a single phase of Mary Shelley's life, the death of Percy B. Shelley, by drowning in the July of 1822 and the years that follow. To hold that in your mind as I speak. This is a story of someone who loses everything and responds by picking up a pen. And what makes this landscape so brutal, what makes these sonnets feel different from everything before them is the accumulation, right? By the time we arrive at the sonnet 81, Mary has already lost three of her four children. Her half-sister Fanny has died, and now she's watching her husband make his boat faster and faster and less safe. There is nothing left to absorb another blow, and the blow comes anyway. Of course, that is the paradox. Now, let me take you through these sonnets in three moments. I will not be discussing what a specific sonnet states, but I will just give you an overview, a general idea of what happens in these 20 sonnets. And when we open with Percy B. Shelley in competition with Byron, not in poetry, of course, that is where he has already accepted his defeat, but on water. He names his boat after a spirit from the last play of Shakespeare's Tempest, a play about a shipwreck, then proceeds to make it faster by making it more dangerous. He insisted on modifications, wanting more and more speed. He must outpace Byron's boat, but each made the Ariel less seaworthy. Things get stranger from here. Visions, doppelgangers, a growing sense of dread, and then the letter arrives. Mary, still weak from her miscarriage that was very extensively discussed before me, she reads the letter that Lee Hunt is asking whether Percy has returned safely, and she already knows what the question means. Still weak from your miscarriage already. Fearing the worst, you collapsed, dropping the fateful page. Then it is all over. Then the silence comes. The world response to Percy's drowning was very ugly, I must say. The conservative press greeted it with something close to satisfaction. The conservative press was unkind in their obituaries. In essence, the outspoken atheist was handed the horrific end he deserved. Good riddance. And yet, those who knew him personally said something else entirely. Because, of course, Byron was that Percy, Byron wrote that Percy was the most gentle, most amiable person he had ever met, then that he would see nothing like him again. What I love specifically about this sonnet here where Lord Byron quotes P.B. Shelley on his death is that it holds both of those things, the cruelty and the tenderness, without choosing between them, and that's the raw beauty of it. Then comes the most psychologically honest poem in the set, because Mary is left with sitting with the question that must have haunted her for the rest of her life. Why didn't Percy save himself? The fishermen were right, because he refused. He might have refused. Why? Pride, maybe, I guess, terror, or something harder to name, a desire for death, because Percy had asked for prussic acid, a poison to have on his hands, and it should be enough to kill his happiness and eventually his whole life. So the poem ends without an answer. Professor Morrissey just leaves it there with Mary, the way it must be stayed. And after that, we have this phase of entire reconstruction where something entirely shifts because Mary Shelley does what she has always done. She writes. She contributes to journals, assists Byron with Don Juan, and begins the enormous task of collecting Percy's scattered poetry, scraps of paper across the continent, a handwriting almost no one else could have understood or read, opposed at every turn by Percy's own father, who would rather his son to be forgotten. And then there were people who said her coldness had crippled Percy's creativity, that the year he spent with her had cost him. Professor Morrissey names that guilt without dismissing it, of course, and Mary never answers to it. And this is not a statement, it is the work, but the poem in itself and the work that she rebuilds slowly and gradually. And that is the way Mary keeps what remained of poet Percy's heart wrapped in silk in the water of her, in the drawer of her writing desk. And whether it was really his heart or not, of course, it's still a speculation, but it became a symbol. She would preserve what everyone else was willing to let disappear. I think that Dr. Morrissey doesn't just give us a grieving widow. He gives us a person doing the hardest possible things, sitting down at a desk in the middle of chaos and grief and guilt and also financial ruin, and still choosing to write. Here, I would like to quote Ernest Hemingway when he says, there is nothing to writing. All you do is to sit down at a typewriter and bleed. And just like that, Professor Morrissey speaks to Mary Shelley directly in second person, always with the pronoun you. It refuses to let her to be an object of study. She remains a subject, someone being addressed, someone being seen and acknowledged. And this brings me towards the final sonnet, the epilogue, and I would like to give it a little bit of special importance because I hold it very close to my heart, and it is the one I keep coming back to it again and again. So, in the epilogue, our author steps out from behind the biography entirely and speaks in his own voice as a teacher who taught Frankenstein for 25 winters. And he pictures Mary not as the famous author only, not as the grieving widow. He pictures her as a student, quite gray-eyed, sitting in the back. And then the last two lines, quite capable of capturing the world. All the brilliant Marys, I have seen you. The girl writing stories in her father's graveyard, the teenager who wrote Frankenstein on a dare, the widow who rebuilt a poet's legacy while people questioned whether she deserved to, the author whose name was removed from her own book. The author of this book, Professor Dr. Morrissey, sees all of it. He sees all of it, and he wants us to see it too. And that's really a beautiful picture. So in order to close, I would like to just quote some lines from the final sonnet, the epilogue. The time has arrived to leave you, my friend. I know, of course, of the remaining years, filled with other victories, other fears, living alongside ghosts until the end. All the brilliant Marys, I have seen you. Thank you, Professor Morrissey, and everyone who listened to me. That was all from my side. Over to the host and organizers.
Thank you, Samir.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all for sharing your insightful and valuable interpretations. I would now like to request Dr. Ted Morrissey to share his thoughts on this special occasion.
Thank you. Thank you, one and all. No, that was very fascinating. As a writer, generally speaking, you don't get a whole lot of response to your work from readers. You hope to, but oftentimes that doesn't happen. And you certainly don't get really in-depth, fully thought out, fully articulated responses. So that's very, very interesting, very exciting. Now, I think you all did a wonderful job of encapsulating the various sections of the poem. When I started working on this, what became this book, I really didn't intend to write a book per se. I just was interested in writing some sonnets. I'd written some sonnets previously from 2012 to 2016 to 2022. My father had passed away, and I missed talking to him, and so I decided that I would write some sonnets in apostrophe, addressing him directly as a way to sort of, again, communicate with him, but also kind of think about our relationship. Luckily, we had a very good relationship. So that was all very pleasant. But then, as I say, I wrote about a dozen sonnets to my father, and then I got back into doing things I normally do, working on novels, academic work, and that kind of thing. But near the end of 2024, I kind of felt that itch again to write some sonnets. I was working on a couple different novels off and on. So I thought, well, I'll take just a couple of weeks and I'll write a few sonnets, just enough to have some sonnets to send out into the world, maybe get them published here and there. And so that was really my main ambition. And I decided I would write about Mary Shelley, who I'd been studying, was very interested in for years. So I wrote a handful of sonnets. Really enjoying the process. And then pretty soon a handful became 10, and then 10 became 20, and then 20 became 40. And I was thinking, well, maybe now I've got a chapbook of sonnets that maybe I could publish eventually. But I just kept going. And in about 3 months, I had over 100 sonnets. And at some point in that process, I realized, okay, I'm writing a biography of Mary Shelley. That wasn't my initial intention, but that's obviously what my psyche was doing. And so they were kind of a hodgepodge of sonnets from different points in her life. And so then I had to go about organizing them into something that made sense as a whole work. And so that's why I really appreciate your analysis, because you basically have sort of identified what I ended up identifying. Okay, I've got these particular sonnets that are about her childhood, and then these particular sonnets about her meeting Percy Shelley, and then these about her writing Frankenstein, and then kind of post-Shelley poems. So in your analysis, you really kind of uncovered my agenda in terms of how I ended up putting the book together. So that was very, very interesting. You obviously know a lot about Mary and her past, and so I don't need to go into a whole lot of basic information, which is terrific. I think some of the things that I discovered about Mary that I didn't know before I started reading and researching to write these poems and eventually the book, she really was just very, very clever and had to be very, very strategic about how she responded to her curiosity and her desire to write and so forth. Let me just give you one very specific example, which kind of comes from the last part of the book, and you alluded to it somewhat. After Percy died, Mary was determined to start producing collections of his poetry. He really didn't have much of a reputation as a poet before his death. He wanted to have one, and Mary believed he should have had one. So she sort of took it upon herself to make sure that was going to happen. But she had a problem. Well, she had several problems. One, as a couple of the sonnets allude to, the poems were scattered all over Europe, some on just scraps of paper, written in Percy's almost illegible handwriting. So that was very difficult. But the bigger obstacle was Percy's father wanted him to be forgotten. He was very upset with his son, with the choices he had made in life, squandering his fortune and all of that. And so Percy's father was helping Mary a little bit financially raise Percy Shelley, her remaining son. He wasn't very generous, but he was helping a little bit. But he threatened to cut her off entirely if she went about publishing a biography of Percy. So she did something that satisfied him, but also satisfied what she wanted to do. In editing his poems, she included the biographical context of each of the poems. And so she sort of secretly did write a biography of Percy Shelley, but did it within the context of his poems. And she actually invented a methodology of editing literary works by putting them in a biographical context. That just isn't something that had been done prior to the early 1800s. So I think that's a great example of her determination and her cleverness. So she kept Percy's father reasonably happy. She was able to get Percy's work out into the world, and she managed to give some biographical information about someone who was pretty mysterious. He was infamous. You know, he had been kicked out of Oxford University because he wrote a pamphlet on atheism and distributed it. And so that got him kicked out of university. So he had this sort of notorious reputation, but she wanted to rehabilitate that and really focus on his poetry and him as a person. So I thought that was you know, a good example of her you know, creativity and so forth. I think another interesting thing about the story of Mary and Frankenstein is that the infamy of the book and it becoming so well known so quickly wasn't based on a lot of people reading it. It was only released in an issue of 500 copies in 1818, so that wasn't very many copies. But it immediately was reviewed in the press and literary journals and so forth, and got a lot of very, you know, negative reviews because it was blasphemous and it was, you know, grotesque in many ways, according to a lot of reviewers. So it developed this reputation, but not very many people actually read it because it did come out in other editions later, but usually those editions were very expensive, and so just the everyday reader didn't have the money to buy and to read Frankenstein. So the public at large had only a bare grasp of what the book was about. And then stage productions began very quickly. In 1823, the first stage adaptations, and it very much simplified the book. It became basically a monster story, a monster chasing, you know, Dr. Frankenstein around the countryside and so on. And then when cinema came along at the turn of the 20th century, and Edison and others started making Frankenstein into movies, first silent movies and then eventually talkies, obviously, they basically use the stage productions as their inspiration and not the novel itself. It wasn't until the 1970s when the second wave of feminism came along in the United States and the West in general that a lot of female authors' work was rediscovered and appreciated for the first time. And that's when really people started reading Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in earnest and taking it for the serious book that she had in mind from the beginning. So just a lot of really interesting things about the book. But again, I think it's ahead of its time in many ways, because how many issues today do people think they have a grasp of because they saw one meme on social media, or they heard, you know, some social media rumor here or there, and so suddenly they feel they understand some person or some movie or some book, and actually they haven't read it or experienced it in any way. And that was actually something that had happened to Mary and to her novel Frankenstein, you know, 200 years before the internet and social media and those kinds of things. I do want to take some questions, but let me share, if I could, just a few of the sonnets directly to you. You obviously, many of you, if not all of you, have read them carefully, so you know. But you're aware of the fact that these are Petrarchan sonnets. They're not strictly metered and rhymed as Petrarchan sonnets traditionally have been, but they're Petrarchan sonnets in the sense of they're divided into two sections, an octave of 8 lines, which introduces the subject of the sonnet, and then a sestet of 6 lines that responds in some way to whatever issue, question, problem has been posed in those first 8 lines. And then that turn from the octave to the sestet is known as the volta. As I wrote the sonnets longhand, I mainly wrote them as prose, and I had that 2-part structure in mind. So I had an idea for the octave, for the subject of the sonnet, but the sestet, the volta, and then the end of the sonnet was very much a matter of discovery. I didn't really know where the sonnet was going until I just started putting the lines on the page, and then the sonnet kind of showed me where it needed to go, where it wanted to go. And then I would take those prose written chunks of text, the octave and the sestet, and then on my computer, I would start to shape them into the poetic lines that would become the 2 parts of the sonnet. Except for one sonnet, I deliberately enjammed the octave with the sestet, so they actually kind of blend together. And anyone who's curious, maybe you can look for that particular sonnet in the collection. It was deliberate. But this is the very first sonnet, and I call it Vindication. It says, "Your mother left you 11 days old, taken away by her newest lover, death. Septic poisoning, likely from the doctor's dirty nails as he groped for her obstinate placenta. You always felt responsible, a lonely little girl burdened with that and a clever mind out of time. Your name echoed her absence. But she bequeathed you her books, her revolutionary spirit, the vindication of your alienated rights. Her words worked to fill the emptiness, the void, as you grew and read and waited, aching for a dangerous affair of your own." And as you probably know, the word vindication is very purposeful there, because Mary's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, is best known even today for her book, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, which came out in 1792. And at the time, it was deemed a very radical book. And it's obviously got a lot of issues that she raises in that book. But in a very broad sense, the thing that Mary's mother was advocating for was for little girls, and girls in general in England, to be educated in the same way that boys were educated. That was her revolutionary concept that was kind of the basis of her book, that little girls needed to have their intellect nurtured just the same way boys did. Mary did not go to formal school, as you know, but luckily her father had a very extensive library, and she had free reign to read whatever she wanted there. Also, their home on Skinner Street in London was sort of nucleus of intellects and writers from throughout England and Ireland and Scotland and so forth. And they would regularly visit William Godwin, her father. And Mary oftentimes was encouraged to engage with them, even as a little girl. And then one other thing that William Godwin did that was really, I think, really interesting. He, of course, had not just Mary in the house, but he had Mary's stepsister Claire after William Godwin remarried. And then he had another daughter, Mary Wollstonecraft's daughter, Fanny Imlay. So 3 little girls in the home. And he had these little lecterns built and put in the parlor. And for after dinner entertainment, Mary and Claire or 2 of the girls would take to these lecterns, these little podiums, and he would throw out some intellectual problem, and they would have to spontaneously debate on whatever issue he had thrown out to them. So, not too many folks doing that these days, I don't think, making their children engage in debate as a pastime and as kind of a fun family activity or whatever. Let me read just another couple of sonnets, perhaps, and then let me see if you all have some questions. The second sonnet is titled St. Pancras, which is the name of the cemetery where Mary Wollstonecraft was buried and where Mary Godwin, then Mary Shelley, spent so much of her time as a child and as a teenager. It was only paint darkness and light, her portrait above the bare mantel, animated by her books, words on a page, darkness and white, and by the stories your widowed father would tell when his new wife wasn't near. The public did its worst to muck her memory, a radical woman, unwed. You sought her like spirit graveside, St. Pancras, place of solace. Proud whenever someone remarked how much you resembled her. You knew. You did more than they could know, both her darkness and her light. And part of what I'm getting at there, trying to get at there, is that based on Mary's letters, her diaries, her novels and stories and so on, nowadays we would probably say that Mary had a depressive personality. She definitely suffered from postpartum depression, but at other times in her life, even before she started having children and having, losing children, she seemed to have issues with depression. And of course, in her day, there was no medication for that. There was no understanding of it really. And Mary Wollstonecraft, her mother, also seemed to suffer from, they would call it melancholia in their day, but we refer to it as depression. And so that's another battle that Mary had, I think, throughout her life. Obviously, the trauma that she experienced would certainly be depressing to anyone, but I think it compounded the sort of natural condition that she oftentimes found herself in. So I think oftentimes when Percy, for example, would complain about her coldness, about her aloofness, about her just not being very much fun to be around, quite frankly, that was oftentimes a reflection of those depressive periods in her life, and she just couldn't help that. We know now she couldn't help that. But even today, people who suffer from depression, people who don't fully understand it. And often they think, well, why can't you just snap out of it? Why can't you just be happy? Why can't you just, resume normal activities or whatever? But obviously it's not that easy for people who are suffering from depression and so on. And then one last poem, and then I'll kind of open it up for questions if you have some. And this is sonnet number 3, Devotion. Did your father love you, or was he simply determined to do his paternal duty, be true to his own philosophy of child rearing and liberal pedagogy, dedicated to his sense of himself more than to you, the daughter whose life claimed that of his wife, his soulmate, death the midwife at your bloody birth? Were they symbols of his affection, the public lectures, the ceaseless lessons, the adult-size erudition, unchecked access to a world-class library in his unmistakably middle-class home, as unmistakable as your destiny to follow his path and hers? And of course, famously, one of the public lectures that her father took Mary to was a lecture on galvanism, where a recently executed person, a corpse, was brought into the auditorium theater and was zapped with electrodes and made to move on the table. And Mary was just a little girl when she was taken to that lecture and watched this body being wheeled into the auditorium and then being zapped with electrodes and moving seemingly of its own accord on the table. So, nowadays, if a parent, exposed a child to something like that, we might consider it a form of child abuse, a traumatizing event. But William Godwin saw it as just a way to educate his daughter and to give her access to the very latest information, including scientific information. All right. Well, I'll stop there. I really appreciate your attention. And as I say, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them as best I can.
Yes, Tamkeen, would you want to speak? We have some more students, actually ex-students, who are also with us, and they've also read the book. And then we'll move towards Ma'am Amrina for closing remarks. Yes, Tamkeen?
Yes, Hello everyone, it's me Sayyada Tamkeen. I recently graduated with a degree in English Literature and Language from NUML University, but NUML still feels like home to me. And for the context, I just want to let my juniors know that for my research paper on Dr. Ted Morrissey's novel, The Trophies of Job, I have exchanged few emails with him, sending him my analysis, and Dr. Morrissey's reactions and feedbacks are always so encouraging, and they have widened my perspective. And I would also like to thank my dearest professor, Dr. Amina Ghazanfar, for inviting me here last night. And I would also like to share my analysis of Dr. Ted Morrissey's sonnet, which is Sonnet 41. And while reading this sonnet, I found myself going back to the moment I read Frankenstein. And when I read about the Victor's reaction, like when he animates this creature, he feels immediate horror, and his reaction was very irrational to me. But this sonnet helped me reinterpret this moment. I could see the similarity between the Victor Frankenstein and Mary, and I think I gained this perspective that creation for Mary Shelley herself was never purely beautiful. It is tied to pain, it is tied to fear, and it is even tied to death, considering her mother's death after childbirth, and considering the multiple deaths that of Mary Shelley's her own child. So the act of bringing something to the world, the act of creating something, always carries this inherent anxiety. And the anxiety, like what if this creation destroys you, and what if this creation turns against you. So Victor, I think, also feels this horror when he created the monster. And yes, I think I could understand Victor's perspective well now, like as Dr. Ted Morrissey has written, terrifying prospect of keeping it alive. So yes, that was my analysis of it, and I genuinely loved listening to all your perspectives. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Well,
Tamkeen.
thank you. Yes, that, for a lot of readers, that part of the novel is kind of a head scratcher. It's kind of enigmatic. Why does Victor have that reaction to the creatures, to the success of his experiment, to bringing the creature to life, and then suddenly he's horrified by it. And there is no one perfect answer, which of course is true of all great literature. It can be, really analyzed and discussed from multiple perspectives. But I think if we do bring Mary's biography and her history into the context of the novel, it does start to make more sense why, that imagined, success of creation, giving birth, or however you want to say it, can quickly turn into the reality of now we have to, deal with this thing that we have created. And I think the earliest readers of the novel and people who reacted to the novel, and they immediately turned that metaphor, into a metaphor, right? Very, very quickly, the idea of Frankenstein's monster became an emblem of what it is today still, of creating something that then gets away from you and that you have no control over then. Today, obviously, one of the things we talk about is artificial intelligence. And, is that going to be the dawn of the machines and the end of humanity, or is it going to be some sort of utopia? Who knows? But a lot of people want AI developers to slow down so we can kind of think more clearly about what it is they're developing and what it's doing and so forth. But I don't think there's much hope of that. I think artificial intelligence is just going to keep moving forward, and then we're going to hopefully not maybe have a sort of own artificial intelligence the world that we find ourselves in just a few months or years. So thank you for your observations.
Dr. Amna, if I can ask a question.
Yes, ma'am. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Dr. Morrissey, a pleasure listening to you. every time, and I have a very simple, basic question. My question is about your choice of the genre of sonnet for addressing Mary Shelley and depicting her whole life in this series. Why did you particularly choose this specific genre? Why not some other? And what provoked me to ask you the question was that you mentioned that you wrote in longhand initially, and your initial writings were more like prose. So, how did you converted them into a whole series of sonnets?
Well, thank you for your question. Well, first of all, the sonnet form I think is attractive to me because normally my creative outlet is in the form of a novel, and when I begin writing a story, I don't know if it's going to be a 4,000 word short story or a 100,000 word novel. It just becomes what it becomes. And I might have to spend years. In fact, I normally do spend years working on whatever that novel becomes. And so the idea of a sonnet is just the opposite of that. I know exactly it's going to be 14 lines, and for whatever reason, I particularly like the Petrarchan sonnet and the way it's structured, and so it's very definite and very finite. And I can write a sonnet in an hour and a half and have a tangible thing, that I can send out into the world if I want to, or in this case, start to gather them together. So in the case of the book, as I mentioned, my initial project was just to write some sonnets, maybe only half a dozen or so, and kind of move on, get back to novel writing. But I was enjoying spending time with Mary, reading her books, reading about her, reading biographies, that it just kept going. My normal process in the morning, I had all these books gathered around me where I sit and do my writing and so forth. And I would just pick up almost one at random and just start reading through it. And some of them were Mary's books. Some of them were scholarly analyses of her work. Some of them were biographies about her. And so I would just keep reading until I came across something that sort of sparked an idea for a sonnet. It might be 5 or 10 minutes into the reading. It might be 45 minutes or an hour into the reading. And then I would put that book away and get out my sonnet notebook, and I would start sketching out the octave and just kind of see where it led. But then after I had quite a few sonnets, I came to the realization that what I was doing was writing a biography of Mary Shelley. And then eventually, after I'd finished I actually wrote 103 sonnets. I ended up cutting 3 before, and publishing 100 of them. But I came across a quote by Edward Hirsch, who's a well-known poet, sonnet writer. And Edward Hirsch talks about the sonnet as a vehicle for being able to plumb the depths of the human psyche, in a particularly effective and unique way. I'm not quoting him verbatim, but he identifies the sonnet as a particularly good tool for getting at the human psyche. And so then I thought, well, maybe I got lucky, and by using sonnets as the form for the biography, maybe I was able to get at some aspects of Mary's persona, her psyche, her soul, whatever you want to call it, that maybe other biographers haven't gotten to, at least not in quite the same way. So maybe it was a happy accident. Maybe it was my subconscious, coming to the rescue and doing something I wasn't consciously aware of in the process. But it was, a lot of trial and error and just sort of letting the project grow organically over time.
Thank you so much,
There's a
Dr.
follow.
Morrissey. I see.
Thank you, Dr.
Okay, there's a
Morrissey.
follow-up
Please go ahead.
question in the messages box also. A student wants to know what's the significance of the style, and are you influenced by some author? There are 3 more raised hands also.
Dr. Amna, our speakers are very curious. The presenters today, they are very curious. We can see
Yeah.
Muskan, we can see Elaf and Manal. They are very eager to ask questions.
Yeah.
Because they
So
have,
you can go ahead and ask. Yeah, go ahead and ask one by one. Maybe you can
okay,
start with
Muskan.
Manal. Okay, Muskan.
Muskan has raised her hand long time back and she is waiting eagerly for the answer.
Okay, I wanted to ask you about the sonnets that you decided to omit. Like the 100 that we have, they're going to stay with us forever. I wanted to know that about the reason for omitting those three. Like you explained how you replaced fraternity with, caprice, but the remaining two, cold and intelligence, what was their subject matter, or what made you completely remove them from the collection? Why not include them in the narrative arc as well?
Well, that's a great question, and in part they were written very early on, before I really kind of understood what I was doing, and so they kind of had a broader scope, whereas I came to write sonnets that had very narrow kind of laser focuses. And so in a sense, their broad scope didn't make them fit quite as well in terms of the style of them. But really the deciding factor was I got stuff wrong. I wanted this to be an accurate biography of Mary once I decided I was writing a biography. And as I looked back at them later on, I realized, oh, I kind of messed that up. I kind of got the chronology wrong in some ways or something. And I tried to tinker with them to bring them more in line with the style of the others, and also correct the information so it actually was accurate. But in both those two cases, the sonnets just sort of hinged on the misinformation, and there really was no way of salvaging them. And besides, I kind of liked the idea of having an even 100 sonnets, so that was fairly easy to jettison those. But basically, I just kind of I basically wrote bad sonnets, so I was happy to get them out of the collection ultimately.
Thank you.
Ella Perslan, you may ask your question.
Okay, so I have this question regarding the initial sonnets specifically. So in the early sonnets, we see that Mary's loneliness feels very intense. So I wanted to ask, like, how did you approach representing a loss? Specifically, I wanted to ask that her mother's loss that she herself couldn't have possibly remembered. And then in many moments we feel emotionally heavier than the things that are historically detailed. So how did you balance the fact with emotional interpretation? I mean, when you mentioned in your book that you had read quite a few autobiographies of Mary Shelley. Then how did you separate that and balance that? And did you think that Mary Shelley's creativity was driven more by her suffering or by her intellectual environment? I really wanted to ask these questions ever since I had read the sonnets.
Thank you for your question. Well, I think the image of young Mary Godwin, sitting by her mother's graveside, talking to her, reading to her, and so on, that's a pretty iconic, famous, literary, historic kind of image, and one that I would talk to my students about, over those 25 years that I taught the book, and so on. And so I probably kind of soaked into my psyche somewhat, that that's, like I said, that we understand just how much she missed her mother, and only knew her through her words and through stories people would tell about her. And quite honestly, a lot of those stories were not very complimentary. She had a kind of wild reputation, which wasn't particularly a thing a woman was supposed to have in her time period. I suppose, I mentioned that I first started writing sonnets to my father after he had passed away. And then my mother passed away in 2020. And so I don't know that I directly channeled my missing my parents, because obviously I'm older and I wasn't a child, fortunately, when they passed. But perhaps some of my own grief and how I was kind of dealing with it, fed into those sonnets some way or another. Maybe I understood or felt that I understood Mary's grief more so now than for so many of those years when I would teach her book, when I hadn't had those personal experiences of parental loss. So it's difficult to say, what all fed into that. But I hope that I managed to get that fairly accurate. We know quite a bit about her childhood, and it was pretty unhappy in a lot of ways. It wasn't just missing her mother. She felt rather estranged from her father after he got remarried. She and her stepmother had a classically bad relationship. In fact, Mary ended up, as you know, being pretty much sent off to Scotland for a couple of years when she was 14, just to basically get her out of the house, it seems like, for a while, so the family tensions could settle down a little bit. So she had a lot of unhappy elements in her life, in addition to, not knowing her mother and so on.
Okay, that was really interesting. Now, if you don't mind, I really wanted to ask regarding your own creation, like your writing and crafts while you wrote the sonnets. So, how did you maintain a consistent voice? Because you have this consistent voice throughout all these 100 sonnets, and while still showing different phases of her life, and while writing these sonnets, we see that. I wanted to ask, did they ever limit what you wanted to express, or while you were expressing yourself in these sonnets, you actually deepened your feelings or creativity? So, and then again, while writing this book, you specifically chose sonnets instead of prose. While you explained why you chose sonnets, I wanted to ask that: have you ever felt that if you chose prose, um, anything would have, if there was anything, it would have been lost or would have been added, so it would add really an impact to uh, the creation and your writing style?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, thank you for that as well. Well, these tend to be little narrative sonnets. And so, as I say, I mainly think of myself as a novelist, and so that narrative drive in my creative engine or whatever still, I think, comes out in these sonnets. They're not metaphysical for the most part. They're very kind of again narrative in basis. Generally, the octave, the beginning of the sonnet, almost always was bigger and fuller and had more stuff in it than what it needed to. And so as I would go from that handwritten version to typing it out and putting it into poetic lines, I was oftentimes having to compress and cut and so on. Whereas the sestet, which I say kind of grew from the octave organically, sometimes it was underdeveloped when I started to try to actually type it into poetry. So oftentimes I was expanding the sestet while I was compressing and cutting the octave. I basically wrote one sonnet a day. I would write one sonnet in the morning, but sometimes that excess stuff in the octave, which I would have to cut from a particular sonnet, I could sort of use as the starting point for another sonnet because it was really getting into some other idea. I had the wonderful experience when I was working on my master's of having a teacher named Juan Felipe Herrera, who was principally a poet. And he eventually went on to become U.S. Poet Laureate, which is a major deal. But But Juan Felipe was a wonderful teacher. And Juan Felipe talked about poetry. And he said that when he wrote a poem, that it would always be longer than what it needed to be. And he would start trimming from the beginning and the end. And what he would end up with was kind of the white, hot middle of the poem, because he said that's where the energy of the poem is. And so I've always kind of kept that in mind over the years. And so I guess I was trying to whittle these sonnets down to that white, hot energy that Juan Felipe always used to talk about in his own poetry. So that may be another factor in my process.
Thank you so much. That's all from my side, Mr. Ted.
Thank you.
Manal, you may ask your question.
Thank you, Amina. Professor Morrissey, I don't think I have very interesting questions, but I'm still curious to find an answer to them. It was very surprising that you mentioned that cinema brought Frankenstein forth. I wasn't aware of that. I always thought that maybe the novel, it was always a famous piece of literature, but I guess the lights, camera, action, it just sort of brought forth that story alive, essentially. So I guess my question is, do you have a favorite adaptation of Frankenstein that you think is that was sort of monumental to your work? That would be my first question. And if you would please answer that, I'll follow it up with my second question.
Okay, yeah. The first film version was Thomas Edison's silent picture, 1900 something, early 1900s. And again, it sort of focused on the creation scene, the monster run wild, and that kind of thing. I don't know that I have a favorite. The 1931 James Whale's black and white film is probably the most iconic film, where we get the green hulking Frankenstein monster going through the countryside, and it's alive, and the sparks and the electricity and all that stuff. Not very accurate to the book, but it certainly was, as I say, an iconic film. I think of all the versions that I've seen, and I've seen a lot, but yet not all of them. I really liked Kenneth Branagh's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein that he did in the 1990s. He, recognized that just about all of the movie versions were very inaccurate and did not really even try to bring out some of the very deep, serious-minded philosophical issues that Mary herself wrote into her novel. So he tried to create a film version that was true to that, and to try to get at some of those ideas. And, it just isn't possible to do a film and completely migrate all of that seriousness onto film. But I think he did a really, really good job. And he takes, he does take some liberties, but I think they're all really interesting liberties. I really like Guillermo del Toro's very recent Frankenstein that came out just this past November. Again, not true to the book in a lot of ways, but a very interesting adaptation. I'm one of those people who, I don't want the movie to be like the book. The book is the book, and if I want to experience that, I'll read the book. What I want the movie to do is, through its adaptation, maybe shine a light on certain aspects of the book that might sometimes be overlooked. So the same is true when I go to Shakespeare plays. I mean, I've seen Macbeth, I've seen, Othello, I've seen, on and on and on, dozens of times, but I still love going to them because I want to see what this director, what these actors, what this costumer, what this fight choreographer did with the text that maybe others didn't do. So I like it when directors take some liberties and take some creative license with a book. But yeah, I think probably the Kenneth Branagh is my favorite in terms of trying to bring out certain aspects of the novel that most directors haven't bothered to.
Right. I think my favorite is the Gene Wildman one, the Frankenstein, the funny one. I don't know.
Yeah, understandable. Yeah.
And Professor, my second question would be to give you some context. This semester, we have two courses that we're studying. The first is post-colonial literature, which is taught by Mrs. Ma'am Amna over here. And the second course that we have to study is called American Literature. In American literature, we studied The Great Gatsby. I understand why we study The Great Gatsby, but I'm not a huge fan of that book. I guess it sort of, it's a very basic rundown of all America stands for and everything. But I guess my question for you would be, what is your favorite post-colonial text, and what is your favorite piece of American literature that you would recommend to us students to read?
Wow, those are a couple big questions. Yeah, I don't know about favorites, so I'm just kind of off the top of my head here. Keep in mind, it's almost 1 o'clock in the morning too here in the U.S. So I don't know if I'm quite as agile-minded as I might be. But over here on my shoulder is William Gass, and he's my literary idol. And I would say anything that William Gass has written would be worth reading. Gass is a stylist. He's not overly concerned with plot, characterization, those kinds of things. He's interested in language and doing interesting things with language. And that tends to be my primary interest as well, in terms as a reader and as a teacher and so forth. So I would say anything that Gass has written would be worth pursuing. Might be very difficult to get hold of, unfortunately, but he's very, very good. I'll tell you, when I was younger, I was really infatuated with the work of Kurt Vonnegut. And I don't know if you're familiar with Kurt Vonnegut very much. Slaughterhouse-Five is probably his best known book. And one of the things I really liked about Kurt Vonnegut's work, or I still like about it, is it's very much a hybrid text. He'll mix science fiction with autobiography. He'll mix historical writing with other kinds of kind of absurdist kind of work or whatever. And so I like his mixing of different genres. And I think he too does a really, you mentioned that Gatsby shines a bright light on some aspects of the United States which aren't necessarily our best features. I think Vonnegut does that as well, but through a different approach. I think through his layering and mixing of genres, he gets at some very important things about American culture and the American psyche and so forth. In terms of post-colonial texts, again, off the top of my head, I really love Jean Rhys's novella Wide Sargasso Sea, which is actually a prequel to Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. It tells the story of Bertha, the mad woman in the attic, so to speak, from her perspective. And so it gives a really interesting perspective on colonialism, post-colonialism, and so forth. So I would recommend Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys as a really terrific post-colonial text.
Thank you very much for showing that. That is part of our course. So maybe that gives this gives us an excuse to invite you for another talk.
Well, you know where I'm at, so yeah, absolutely. I teach Wide Sargasso Sea in one of my college courses as well. So.
Oh, that would be interesting because we have that as part of our course too. So I'll discuss that with you. It's already too late, Dr. Morrissey, and we have many more questions, but I understand this is already very late for you. So over to you, Amina.
Thank you, Dr. Morrissey, for your kind words. And as we draw towards the conclusion of this book launch, I invite our head of department, Dr. Muntazir Mehdi, to share a note of thanks.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you so much, Dr. Morrissey. We have already had quite a long discussion, but I'm happy to see the students participating so enthusiastically, so eagerly, so keenly, and hopefully we'll continue doing such things for them. We have already planned quite a few things there in the pipeline. So we have this mission of developing and growing interaction with the international faculty. Whenever you meet people from other sites, you always learn a lot. and people you do not know, when you interact with them, they're always source of, not always, but occasionally they are source of inspiration for the students and faculty members both. But definitely it takes time in sensitizing people to these kind of things. So hopefully we'll keep doing so. So Dr. Morrissey, thank you so much for your time, because our day has started and your night is waning. So we must give you time to take rest now. So we'll continue coordinating with you. We'll continue learning from you. Our students, you might have seen the way they have explained the things to you, and the way they have been inquisitively asking you questions about your own writing. So we have the potential, you have the knowledge, so both the things can work together and can make this world a new world again, this academic world. I can see a lot of books behind you. I wish I had these books with me. So we'll definitely meet once. Either you will be here or we'll be there with you. And again, I would like to remind and reiterate the things we have discussed when nobody was between us. So we'll try to make it practical. We'll try to materialize this as well. We'll try our best to bring as many things as we can for our students to the campus or to this virtual world. And I'm happy to listen to these 4-5 students, the ones who presented. Perhaps I met Manal for the first time. Manal Khalid, I think, yes. You also did well. I'm just taking your name because I saw you for the first time. The rest of the students have been meeting. I know Ilaf, I know Amina, and there was one odd man out also. He also presented well. So, Dr. Amna, thank you so much for your efforts. I would not like to forget Miss Amrina Qayyum's contribution, and I'm really happy to mention that Miss Amrina is almost in every committee, not by default, but by skill. I mean, whoever is working, so they try to approach Miss Amrina. They come to my office and tell me that Miss Amrina is also with us. So I say that I've already given her a lot of things to do, and she's here also. Dr. Morrissey, I tell you, we have a newsletter. So Miss Amrina is working on that. We have a students' annual magazine. Miss Amrina is working on that. We have this webinars committee, and Miss Amrina is working on that. And then we have a writing resource center. Perhaps she's also into it. So she's an asset for us. She's an old hand, at the same time a gold hand. So we never want to lose her, the way she's been working for the department, and many other students and many other faculty members. So as I have to mention Dr. Amina and Ms. Amrina right, because they're right in front of me. So our whole department is very energetic and interactive, hardworking, diligent. I'm really happy because I sleep peacefully and well at night, as I know that the team is working well. And I usually say that we are not just a department, we are a team. Working in a team, working for the university, working for the country, working internationally, and working for our students. So once again, thank you so much, the organizers, the students, the presenters, and especially Ted Morrissey. So thank you so much, everybody.
Well, thank you, everyone, for your interest, for hosting this event, and for reading my book and so on. I was just going to mention anyone who didn't get to ask their questions. If you wanted to email me or send them via some message system, I'd be happy to respond to them. So, but thank you very much, everyone, for the time and the attention, and I look forward to seeing you all again.
Thank you very much, Dr. Morrissey, and good night.
We'll dear students, I'm sorry, dear student, your classes are in progress, so please go back to your classes. You have time.
Yeah.
You can, yes.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.